Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to go through how to create a nature scene something like this. I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail on the creation of the individual assets, but if you're a Patreon subscriber or you become a Patreon subscriber, I will upload this file and you'll get all the assets that I've created for it. So you can see we've got a number of different effects here. We've got quite a few geometry node setups to create the different distributions of plants. As you'll see later on, the different kinds of plants are distributed differently for different parts of the scene. I'm using an HDRI for the light. There's no simple sun lamp in the scene at all. I've got this jumping fish here and you can see there's ripples in the water as well as a general disturbance of the surface of the water anyway to give these interesting sort of painterly reflections. And I've also got some mist added to the scene, which is slightly variable rather than just being a simple distance-based mist. So it shouldn't be too long a tutorial, which it would be if I went through creating each of the assets, but we'll see how we get on. So to begin with, we just need to add a plane and we'll scale that up quite a bit. And one of the most important things when you're using geometry nodes to add particles and assets to a scene like this is make sure you apply any scaling or transformation. Otherwise, you may have issues later on. So scale that up a little bit and I'm just going to go into edit mode, right click and say subdivide. And if I open this up, I'll increase the subdivision a little bit and then I'm going to right click and say subdivide again, which gives me a new version as it were. But then I'm going to start to increase fractal, which will start to give me some variation in the surface. And I'll increase that a little bit. Right click, subdivide again, and I'm sort of getting small bumps now. I do want a fair bit of geometry, because the geometry nodes will use this in order to determine where to instance my particles, and I need to be able to have sufficient geometry in order to be able to define that. So I'm just going to put that up again, perhaps we'll increase that slightly, one more, and then we'll come out of edit mode, control 1 for the moment, and we'll set it to shade smooth. So control 1 has just added a subdivision surface on there to increase the geometry further. So I wanted a sort of river running through it, so what I'm now going to do is go into orthographic view, look from above, press C for circle select, and then I'm just going to start to define my river. I can draw it all directly like that, or I can just control plus to increase it. That looks a little bit angular, so we'll widen it here and remove a bit here just to make it a bit more round, but we'll widen it here as well because this is where the camera is going to be looking from, so arguably the most important area. I'm not going to make an identical scene to the one I made before. I'm just going to use this to demonstrate the principles. So I'm going to turn proportional editing on, GZ, and you can see that gives me a bit of a fall off for the riverbed. We don't want it too deep, river or stream. And there it is, that's that created. So we'll name this land. And as I said, we'll apply scale. I'm now going to add another plane, make it up to about the same size, and this is going to be our water plane, so I can make that easily visible here. I'll just add a basic material, and in the viewport display we'll give that a slight blue color. And now GZ, and I'm just going to move it around to where I need it to be to represent the water, so something like that. Again, I'm just going to apply scale, and then we'll call that water. I'm going to hide that for a moment because I'm now going to go into object data and set up vertex groups with the land. So I'm going to click plus there. We'll look from above and we'll go to weight paint because I don't necessarily want vertex groups. These are going to be used, by the way, for defining where things are, where the rocks are, where the trees are and so on. I don't want them necessarily all on or all off. I want them to vary a bit. So first of all, I'm going to define where the water is. So that's going to be around here. I can just about make it out. Just colouring that in fairly roughly. It doesn't matter too much as long as I don't get any plants growing in the middle of the river. And I can blur it a bit here too. I'll click in here and we'll call this water. That's defining where the water will be in my land. I'm going to add a new vertex group and I'm going to colour in somewhere around here and perhaps here as well. Maybe even here, and this is going to be my trees, so we'll blur that one. We can even smudge it, as you can see, and that's good because it means we haven't got a hard line of where the trees will be. There'll be a fall off element to it. So if you right click, you can change the weight, so I'm just going to turn that down slightly so we can get a bit more variation. Red will mean maximum density of, in this case, trees, and obviously blue means none. We'll call that one trees or tree line, and then a third one, which I'm going to make pretty much everything else. So this is going to be my plants, my woodland plants as well. So we'll have those here. You notice I've turned the strength down. So that's going to give me less than maximum density. So I'm going to turn that weight back up for the moment. And then I'm going to just do some areas where we've got maximum density, but not have it solid blocks. So I'm leaving little gaps. Now, obviously I can do that also with textures, but I wanted to control what was going on in terms of the density. So we'll go with that for the moment. And that's going to be, we'll just call it flowers. I did a few more than that, but that gives you the general idea. So we can come out of weight paint now. So at this point, let's add some light to the scene so that we can then start to add materials and things like that. I'm going to call up a new window. We'll go to the shader editor and we'll change to world and say use nodes. I'm going to add texture, which is an environment texture. We'll connect that into here, just moving my camera out there of that collection, and we'll turn it on so I can see where it is. And we'll just back it up a little bit and we'll look at the rendered view. So at the moment, there's nothing there. We've got a funny color because I've added this environment texture without actually adding a texture. So I'll now open this up and we'll go to my HDRI textures. And I think I used one from here. So this one's got a nice bright light in it, as well as some trees. So we'll try this one. Yep, I think that is the one I used. So you can see, even though I've added no lamps to the scene, adding this HDRI, which is effectively, if I come out of orthographic view, you can see it, it's effectively all around the scene. That bright spot in the sky there is providing all the light that the scene needs. In fact, the whole scene is providing light, because obviously there's light reflecting of these other parts of the scene, and it's giving you a much more natural light. It's not always enough. Sometimes the HDRIs don't give you enough light or enough directional light for what you want to achieve, but in this case it's quite a good HDRI for lighting my scene, and so it will be fine. You can see there's light on these shadowed areas, it's not just dark. So that's good. So the next thing, we'll look from above, go into edit mode, select everything and just say you unwrap. It's still a fairly simple plane, so it should unwrap fine. Come out of edit mode and we'll go to object shader now and we'll say new and we'll call this ground. And I did a slightly more complicated shader setup with this one just to minimize issues with tiling, but we'll work through that as we go. So I'm just going to add an input which is texture coordinate because we'll probably need that shortly. And I'll add under vector a mapping node. We'll take the UV coordinates into the mapping node. We won't change anything at the moment. And then I'm going to add a texture, which is an image texture, put the mapping node into that and the output of that into the base color for the moment. And then I have some ground textures that I used, and we'll start with this one. And you can see that's too large at the moment because this is relatively huge. So I can either change the size of the UV map, and I will actually do that at this point just to check that out. So you can see at the moment, the UV map is about the size of the image. So I'm just going to make it much bigger, and you can see the image that gets reflected onto the object becomes much smaller. So in terms of the scale, it's a lot closer now. It may or may not be exactly right. I'd have to spend some time looking at that, but we also have this tiling issue. So what I'm now going to do is add two more nodes. So we've now got another mapping node. So I'll just take UV into that, and I'm going to change this one for a different texture, and we'll go for one of my grass textures. We'll go with this one, fairly brown grass. And if I plug that one in, you can see there it is. Again, we have the tiling issue. It's not too visible from here, and frankly, once it's covered in particles, probably wouldn't be that visible at all. But we can improve it nonetheless. If I go to material view, we can see it without lots of rendering being necessary. So we'll now add a color mix node and put both of the textures into there. At the moment, it's at 50%. And obviously you can see it shades between one and the other. They happen to be the same size, so they completely overlap in terms of the edges. So it doesn't help with the tiling effect, even if I go with 50% of each. So we need to do something a bit more. So the first thing I'm going to do is rotate one of them slightly. Come over to this one, and under rotation, I'm just going to turn Z around a little bit so that it doesn't align. And now if I switch between one and the other, you can see they don't align now. I can also adjust the scale slightly. So we'll go with 0.7 perhaps for that one. So they're now both different scales and at different angles. This mapping node was just here in case I needed to independently tweak the scale. So we've got that, and now what we need to be able to do is to be automatically switching between one and the other, because even if I switch to 50%, Essentially, we get the worst of both cases because we can see the tiles of the diagonal one and to some extent the tiles of the other. So I'm now going to add under texture a noise texture. Also going to add under converters a color ramp. We'll put the factor output of the noise into the color ramp. And then I'm simply going to control my mix node with the output of that color ramp and bring these two control points quite a bit closer together, and I set them to ease as well to give a more gradual change from one to the other. And you don't have to just do this with two, of course, you could use more than two. And another element is the size of the noise. So you can see how that's drifting across the two areas. Even this won't completely eradicate those edges, but you can see they're a lot less visible now, and we can move this around to try to, if there's some particular areas where they're showing up, we can remove them like that by just moving the noise around. And as I say, you can even add more iterations of this should you want to. So that's given us a basic colors, but we need a bit of texture on the ground as well. So I'm going to add another color ramp and just put that in there for a moment. That will turn it black and white. And then I'm going to narrow these points in, and I'm really just looking to select for parts of the texture that I think will give me interesting bumps and lumps. So if we zoom in on that, you can see we've got bits of grass or pine needles, whatever they are, and that's now highlighting them. I'm going to disconnect that from there now, just leave it mid-gray. I'm going to add under vectors bump node and take that color into the height of the bump node. That then goes into my normal input on the principled shader, and after a moment's processing you can see we started to get a texture on the ground. And if I go to rendered view now, you can see it even represents shadows. That's the beginning of adding a bit of texture. We can also add, of course, another noise texture, and I'll add a converter which is a math node. Take the factor into the math node, we'll set this to 0.1 and we'll set it to multiply, and then take that into displacement and then turn the noise frequency, as it were, up. Now I think the bump is a bit high at the moment, and certainly that noise is very high. Turn the detail up as well. And if we don't want this sort of swirling around the lumps and bumps in the landscape, we may also want to just take just the UV mapping into the vector input of the noise. Now you can see it looks a lot more reasonable. I'll go with 0.025, maybe even less than that, 0.01, maybe 0.0025. There we go. So that's getting better, and I'll turn the noise scale up even higher, and it just adds a little bit more noise to the scene and more variation. And with nature scenes, the more variation in things, in textures and colors, the more natural it looks. So now we can plug our original color back into the landscape, and we're getting a little bit more there, and we can perhaps increase the strength of that a little bit as well. And finally, I think for the color, I'm going to add a gamma node in there just so that I can intensify and darken the color of the landscape a bit too much. So it's always best to sort of start too low, go too high, and then you've got an idea of where the right value is, rather than just stop as soon as you think it looks all right. There's our basic material for the land. Now we're ready to start adding assets to the scene. So as I said, rather than going through building each one, I'll explain them, but I'm just going to add them in by appending them from a previous file. So here's a quick way, once you've got a file with assets in it, a quick way of bringing them into another scene. So I'm going up to File, and I'm going to say Append, and it opens a folder, and I'm going to go to my scene blend file, and you see we get what appear to be other folders in there. And I'll go to my objects, and here are all the assets. I don't want the planes themselves, but I do want all the assets. So we'll select all of those. In fact, I'm going to select everything and then just go through and deselect the things that I don't want, because there's quite a few that won't be necessary. So everything I've selected is basically the assets that I created for the other scene, the assets for which I wanted multiple instances. So I'll just click Append. You can link instead of appending, and that means if you modify the objects, they will appear modified in both the original blend file and the new one. By appending, you're effectively making copies. So I'm selecting my trees, and there they all are. They're over here. I obviously made the scene much bigger previously, and looks like I brought in something I didn't need to as well. So I think at this point, I will make my landscape bigger again, just so that it's comparable with previous scene that I did, and we'll apply the scale. I always like to make my cameras bigger because it just makes it easier to see where they are. And I'll need to scale up my water as well, but we'll hide it again. At this point, I think I'm just going to hide the various grids. So if we have a look at these assets, start with these, they look a little bit strange. If I go into rendered view, bear in mind we're doing this in cycles, so there are a few things if you decide to do this in Eevee that you'll need to do slightly differently. But you can see these have got alpha textures on them to to give us the effect of ferns. There'd be a lot of geometry if I built those from scratch. Though that said, as you'll find, I actually have a fair bit of geometry on a lot of these assets anyway, and it works much better now using the geometry node system to distribute instances rather than the old particle system, which would start to struggle quite quickly. This is the berries of some kind of lily that grows in woodland. I've got some clover leaves here and rough approximations of clover flowers. They're very small in the scene, so they're not perfect. This is called a fritillaria. It's another woodland flower. These very quick representations of daisies, again, they're very small in the scene, though not here. And I've got some trees here, and I've got a number of tutorials that talk about how to create trees. Another important asset in the scene is I've got a number of different grasses here, and I've got some smooth rocks, so they're not too high in geometry. And then finally I made some bulrushes. And you can see I went all over the place with my scale. It is easier if you keep them approximately the same sort of scale, but some of these were imported from other scenes that I'd created as well, so they tended to be various different sizes. So my trees have all come into one group, but some of the other things haven't. So I need to put things into their own collections now to make it easier to use them. So trees are already done. So bulrushes, I'll put those into their own collection. So we just hover over this area, press N, say new collection, and we'll just say bulrush. And then I need a grass collection. So you can see I've got quite a few different types of grass plants. Clover, I think I gave its own collection. Wasn't really strictly necessary, but I'll do that. It could have just been put in with the grass, for example. But by doing this, you can individually control the density of things and the distribution of them by doing their own weight painted vertex groups. So daisies, I think I'm going to put those straight in with the grass. Even though they're not grass, they're obviously going to be wherever the grass is. And then ferns, these flowers, the nettle plants, spiral plant, red berry, those are all going to be woodland flowers or woodland plants. And then a collection for rocks. And you notice I've got a fish asset there as well, which we'll use later. So I'll just drag that up here and put it in the top collection. So we've got all these different collections now. Be careful because you can end up with things in multiple collections. And when you're adding new assets, they can end up in a collection which you didn't intend, which can be a problem if you're instancing thousands of them when you didn't intend to. So for the first one, let's do the easiest one, which is going to be the rocks. Now it's possible to do this by doing multiple different geometry nodes, but I decided just to do it with one geometry node setup, but have sections within that geometry node setup that related to each of the different assets. What I mean by that will become clear shortly. So we'll go to the geometry node editor with the ground selected, and we'll click new, and we'll just move those apart. And I'm immediately going to add under geometry a join geometry node and just put that there. Reason is, if I cut that line, the ground is still there, the landscape is still there, but I can't see it anymore. So I need to be able to, whatever else I do, have that still making its way through the geometry node setup. So I'm now going to, under points, add a distribute points on faces node, and we'll just drop that in there. So you can see that's broken that link already. All we've got is the points, the landscape itself has disappeared, and that's why we need that join geometry node. So now we've got the points and the landscape itself. So I want to affect the density by where I want the rocks to be, and I want the rocks essentially to be in or right near the water. So I'm just going to take this option and feed that into density. I'm going to need to do a bit more with it than that, but we'll start with that point. If I go to my modifiers and look at the geometry node, I've now got this available. Currently just says density. I'm going to come up here just so that I don't forget with this node selected, and you can see there's the density input, and I'm going to change the name to rocks. And then down here I'm going to click this little flag symbol, and you can see it's gone blank, and I can now click in here and I can select the different vertex groups that I created. So I'm going to select the water vertex group here, and you should be able to see now that all those little points that were created are all appearing in and around the water area. There's probably too many of them at the moment, but we'll worry about that in a moment. So now over here, here's my rocks. I'm just going to left click that and drag it over to here, and I've got a collection here. I'm going to click separate children and reset children. This is so that I can instance all of the different rocks. So I'm going to put that down here. This has created the points. What I now need to do is to distribute instances on those points. So I add under instances, instance on points, and I'll drop it in there. And then I'm going to take this collection info for rocks and I'm going to put that into instance. And you can see I've now got a lot of different rocks appearing. They all appear to be the same rock at the moment. So I'm going to click that here. We go to rendered view. There they are. So now I need to randomize a few things, but I'm also may need to adjust the base size of the rocks. In this case, I probably don't, but I will use it in some of the other versions of this group of nodes. So I'm going to add under geometry a transform node and just drop that in there. And if I wanted to, I can rescale this. So I could say 0.1, for example, and they're all in fact too small to see, or 2, and you can see they're much bigger. But it affects all of the rocks going into here. It's not just affecting some of the rocks. But for the moment, I'm just going to leave that as it is. But it also allows me to do things like rotate them. So you can see they're all rotating there. But I also need to make sure that I'm getting different rocks appearing. Currently, it's just giving me the first rock. So I'm going to add under utilities a random value. Just drop that there for the moment. And I'm going to set it to integer because integer is a whole number and there's no point in floating numbers for what I'm going to use it for. And that's in order to select the instance. So the instance index, each of those rocks has a number, which is an index number, which identifies which rock it is. So if I put a random number into there, and you can't be sure where that index has started, so you just make it a big number, and then you can be sure you will be selecting one or more of the rocks. And now we should be getting different rocks being selected based on the seed and so on. They're all still exactly the same size though. So I'm going to grab that random value and put that here. And this time I'm going to change it to a vector because rotation and scale are vectors. So we're going to affect rotation first of all. We'll put that into there. And because this is Euler, we'll need much bigger numbers in here. So I'm going to put the largest number. We're going to go up to 400 or 500 in Z, but I'll put something on the others as well. I've just randomly selected something there. So now you can see in terms of rotation, we've got a much better distribution of the rocks. And then we'll duplicate that and we'll change it to float. Now you might think I should have this as vector for scale, but if I do that, well, I won't plug that in because they're very large. But if I was to do that, if I set these to 1, for example, and then plug this into here, it might be what you want, but you can see I've got a lot of very flat rocks, and that's not what I want. All I really want is to change the overall scale of the rock. And a quick and easy way to do that is to simply change this to float. So it's only providing one value, but luckily Blender just says, oh, you put a float into a vector, you must mean the same number into each. So I can now increase this. So the minimum is 0, and I obviously don't want 0, there's no point. I want it to be big enough to be seen, and then the maximum, whatever I find is about right. Now the density is actually still a bit too high on here. If I highlight them all, you can see there's still way too many rocks there. So I'm going to add a couple more nodes. So I'm going to add under utilities a map range node and drop that there. And then just because I may use it elsewhere, I will be using it later. I'm going to add under utilities a math node and we'll set that to multiply. So in theory, I can do everything that I need to do with the map range. I don't strictly need the multiply node, but it's just a quick and easy way to do things. So right now, what this map range is doing is nothing, because what it's saying is any value between 0 and 1 is converted to a value between 0 and 1. So obviously it doesn't change it. What I can do is say 0.1. And now you can see the overall density of the rocks has changed. I can obviously do the same here. I'm multiplying it up or reducing it down. Or I could add a minimum. So I could change this to add and add a minimum value of 0.1. So I would get a maximum value of 0.1 out of here, but then this would add 0.2. So I'm just going to set that back to 0 for the moment because I don't really need it. And I think 0.1 is about right. So that's my initial node setup for the rocks. So I'm now going to select all of these nodes, and then under nodes, I will make it a group. It seems to just change oddly to start with, but that's because you're inside that group. If I press tab, we can come out of it and it says node group. And we can go up to here and we can just say rocks and give it a label of rocks as well. There is our original geometry node set up, and there is our group, which is rocks. And the reason I made it a group is so that it's easy to copy it and make new ones. So let's do the trees now. So I'll duplicate that. But first of all, before you do anything, notice that there's a 2 appeared in here. And what that tells you is I've got 2 instances of this rock group. If I change either of them, they will both change. And I don't want that. I want this to be a unique group. So click that little 2 there and it will become its own node group. It's still called rocks at the moment, but if I press N and call up this side menu, it's actually rocks 001. We can change that to trees. So I'm just going to connect it up here at the moment, and I'm going to connect it here. So the mesh obviously connects as before. I'm just going to link those 2 together just to make that a bit easier to look at. And then I'm going to link this value input up to its own input here. You can see we've got rocks all over the place now because it's not using the water option. We'll click the little flag symbol and we'll go for trees. Now you can see we've just got some rocks appeared where the trees are. If you want to, you can select one of the previous groups and just press M, and there you can see that the original rocks have now disappeared. You can see it sort of draws a line through it there, and I can see the rocks out here. So we can now press Tab with that one selected, and you can see we've got our rocks group here. I'll click in here and I will select trees. So obviously we've got a problem with rotation, which is not surprising because trees don't grow the way rocks rotate. So let's address the rotation first of all while it's easy to see. Essentially, this rotation value needs to be 0 or close to 0. So let's just put 1 in there at the moment. That's still too much really. So 0.025 maybe. And there you can see our trees are essentially upright now, but possibly a little large. So we can come down to here. The smallest may be a bit too small, hard to say at the moment, but certainly the largest is too large. So we'll bring the size down a bit there, somewhere around there. And if we want to have different tree distributions, we will need to vary the seed. So I can click this here. Now, trees are obviously a significant part of the scene, so you may well want to be able to easily try different seeds for the tree. So again, I'm just going to pull that out to the edge of the group. It's called seed at the moment. And then I'll take that out to the edge here. We'll select the group input. We'll go to group, and then we can select the seed and just say something like tree seed. So now we've got an input out here, which we can just play with to adjust what's going on there. And we probably should name this value as trees, just so we know if we get mixed up, we know which vertex group to associate. So I'll go with that for the moment. We can turn our rocks back on. At this point, let's set the water up a little bit. So we'll turn the water back on, go to rendered view, and we'll look through the camera. So I'm just going to reduce the focal length of the camera a little bit so we get a bit more of the scene. And we'll go to the settings and we'll turn viewport max sample down to 64 and 128 for there, just so that it renders a bit more quickly. Okay, we're ready to do our water material now. So we'll select the water and we'll say new, and we'll go to the shader editor, and we've got our basic principled shader on there at the moment. I wanted the water to have a slight cast to it rather than just be completely clear, but I'll set it to bright. Obviously I want it very shiny, so I'm going to set the roughness to a very low value, 0.005. And the main thing I need to play with now is transmission. If I turn this all the way up, we have completely transparent water, which doesn't look bad. And transmission roughness, obviously that gives a sort of roughness to the surface of the water. So I went with a transmission roughness, still very low, 0.023, but I'm going to put a certain amount of surface texture on the water, or surface bump on the water. So I also wanted to add a layer weight node. So under input, we'll select layer weight. This one gives us information about the angle that light bounced off the surface into the camera if it was really going that way. Essentially the idea that at certain angles you wouldn't be able to see into the water, but at steeper angles you'd be able to see right down into the water. So that's what this does for us. So I'm going to take the facing output and put that into transmission, and then I went for about 0.8. You can see the water surface is getting darker as I go up. Doesn't really do a great deal other than control the overall transmission at the moment because I haven't really got any surface ripples. So we'll do that now. We're going to have a ring of ripples coming away from where a fish is jumping at some point, but before then we need some overall surface perturbations. And there's various different ways of doing this. In the past I've done it with purely a wave simulation, but distorted waves, or a combination of wave and noise. But for this one we're just going to use noise, as I think that gives a reasonably good appearance. So under texture we're just going to add a noise texture. Where would we be without that node? Certainly it would be difficult to do nature simulations. And we're going to add under vector a bump node. So I'm going to take the factor of the noise into the height on the bump node, and then the output of the bump into the normal. And once it's rendered a little bit, you can see we've got some what look like very large waves appeared over here, and that's because the noise scale is very low at the moment. Let's try 60. That's a lot more frequent little waves on the surface, but they're a bit large right now, and the scale is too large still as well. So we'll now go for a much lower strength. We'll go for 0.05 for the moment, and that starts to become a lot more reasonable. And we'll turn the scale up a bit. We'll go for 85. I also turned the detail up, and that sort of gives you even smaller noise on a higher scale. And then we can perhaps come down on the strength a little bit, 0.04. And the idea of this is really just to get this effect of the ripples slightly distorting the reflections of the trees and things like that without completely removing them. So you can see this is a reflection of that tree, but it is distorting it slightly. We can even try a higher scale. The higher the scale, the smaller the individual ripples, and obviously the lower the strength, the less significant they will be. So if we went down to 0.03 for example, you can see those reflections start to become a bit more visible. We can see more detail of the reflected things. And that's all I did for the water. So now we're ready to put in some of the other assets to the scene. So I'll select the landscape again, we'll go back to non-rendered version of the scene. I'm going to hide the water again, and we'll go to the geometry node editor again. I haven't got too many rocks in the scene, so I'll leave them in, but I'm going to mute the trees just so that things work a little more quickly. I'm going to duplicate the trees, unmute it, and obviously click that little 2, and we'll call this one grass. We'll take the geometry into that one, and we'll take a connection to the outside world, as it were, into there. We'll just select that one, select value, and we'll call this grass. Now the observant among you may have noticed I didn't actually create a vertex group which was grass. The reason for that is because I felt for grass it was essentially everywhere except under the water. So I can use this water one, but I need to just do something with it. So let's go back to our geometry nodes, click this, and we'll select water. Currently this is set to trees, so we're going to get something odd when I do this. And there it is. We've got a load of trees running along our river at the moment. Obviously not what we wanted. So I'm going to go into that one. And first of all, we're going to change the collection that we're using. And we'll just select the grass collection. So we've got a slight issue, which is fine. And that's with our daisies. Previously, I think I'd added these separately. So I'm just selecting each one and applying rotation. You can see they've come up now. The only problem is they're much bigger than the grass assets, so I will need to rescale them as well. So my grass assets over here. That's the problem with doing something slightly differently during the tutorial, because you think you know better than you did when you did it. So I'm just applying scale to each of them, and that's okay now. They're about the right size. That's brought in the grass and our daisies. As it happens, they're all randomly placed. We can probably add a little bit more variation in their vertical orientation. So we'll make that one try 0.1. That's fine. But obviously at the moment they're running along the riverbed, which is not what we want. And the way I can correct that is over here. So currently the input is 0 to 1 and the output is 0 to 0.1. But why not the other way up? So if the input's 0 to 1, why not have an output which is 1 to 0? And as you can see, that's quickly inverted it. We've still got the rocks there, but we've now got our grass and daisies outside of that point. I can either change this 1 here to a bigger number, or I can change this one, having set this to multiply, in order to get a lot more grass. And you generally are going to need quite a lot of grass in your scene for it to look convincing. So let's try 10. And this grass is relatively high poly, and yet it's still managing to bring that into the scene absolutely fine. And if I turn my water on now, you can see I've still got a bit of grass in the water, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I'll turn my trees on as well, and you can see we're starting to get an interesting scene now. I perhaps could lower the water slightly, water level, and then we'll have a look at the rendered view. So this is the point where you might want to play around with things like the tree seed, because that will also affect the amount of light coming into the scene. You can of course rotate the HDRI. So if we go to shader editor and select world, we can add an input which is texture coordinate, and if we just say generated to start with, you see that doesn't make any difference, but we can now add a vector mapping node, and I'm just going to blank the land for a moment so it renders a little more quickly, and then we can try rotating Z, and you can see the HDRI is moving around. So that's a bit more interesting. Bring it around a little further, and you can see we've got the light coming in more behind the camera now. And perhaps I'll raise that water up again slightly, and if need be you can adjust these vertex groups in order to shave away where you don't want things growing. But I think having a bit of the grass-like objects appearing in the landscape actually adds a certain amount to it. Possibly need to reduce the scale slightly, and we'll do that under geometry nodes, and perhaps increase some of the randomness. So here we go into our grass, press tab to go into it. So this bottom one is scale. Again, if we wanted to play around with it a lot, we could drag this value out. But if I just drop that slightly, you can see the maximum size is getting smaller. And then we can increase these to get a bit more variation in the angle of the grass. I think it can be even smaller than that. When you decrease the size, you'll often find you need to increase the density of them or the number of them. So I might put that up to 15 now. You'll see that's filled it in again. So I'm not going to go into every single one of the assets, but I'll just do, I did one more vertex group, which was flowers. So we'll just do that one. So we'll select our trees again. Again, remember to click that little 2, press N to bring up the options for it, connect it into the geometry and connect it as it were to the outside world. We'll call this one flowers, and then we'll go into it and we'll change this to woodland plants. I haven't added the clover into the grass either, but that's easily done. And no doubt the size is going to need to be changed. I'm just going to come out and mute the grass and the trees so that we can see what we're doing better, and then connect that into the geometry. So you can see, as I guessed it would be, it's rather large at the moment. So let's turn the scale down. And in fact, that's such a large scale, I'm going to put a multiplier on it. So I'm going to add under utilities a math node, drop that in there, set it to multiply, and then we'll set that to something like 0.1. That's already getting close now to the sort of size we want. So we'll go with that for the moment. But obviously we go to our geometry node, we need to do something with that. But obviously we need to set our vertex group. So I'll just give that a name and then click the little flag symbol and select flowers. I'm reasonably okay with the angles. So let's give that an actual render. So it's coming on. I think what I'll do, it took a little while to render that. So we'll bring this down now. I think we'll have the viewport down at 32 samples and we'll have the render down at 64. Under light paths, I'm going to turn off reflective and refractive caustics. We don't need them. In an ideal world, we would use them for certain effects in the water, but for a scene like this, they're really not necessary, and they do add a certain amount of noise to the scene. I'm about to start the volumetric effect, so I'm going to turn this up so that we get a few more bounces in the volumetric element, in other words the mist. And then also under render passes, I've turned on denoising data, which will be the last thing I show you that we can use. I'm just going to go to my modifiers for the landscape and just turn off the view of the trees and what have you by just removing from viewport the geometry nodes. So we're going to add the mist now. So I'm going to put my cursor there, and then I'm going to add a mesh which is a cube, and we'll just increase the size of that to about the size of the landscape, but it doesn't need to be that tall, so we'll reduce it a bit on the Z. And one thing I can already tell is I probably need to adjust the clipping plane for the camera, so we'll send that out a bit. Now I can see the edge there, and that gives me a better idea of what's going on. Just needs to enclose the landscape really. I did put a secondary landscape with a geometry node system for trees, just to give me some sort of mid-distance trees. Obviously I did fewer trees and their scale was slightly adjusted as well. I'm going to go to rendered setting now, and obviously we're inside a cube, so we can't see anything at the moment. But under shader editors and object, I'm going to change the cube's name to mist. With the mist object selected, I'm going to say new, and we don't need the principled shader this time. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to add under shader, a volume scatter node. And obviously very important, that goes into the volume input, not the surface input. I set it to a slightly blue color, and obviously if we turn the density down, we'll actually be able to see our landscape again. So if I go to 0.01, you can just about make out that our landscape is there buried in the mist. But I wanted the mist not to be completely flat. It's not like a London fog. So I need a gradient of the mists. I'm going to add, unsurprisingly, under texture, a gradient texture. And the factor output of that ultimately goes into the density, but you can see it isn't working yet. So I'm also going to add, under converter, a color ramp. I ended up having that at ease. And then if I start to bring this up, you can see we've got a sort of bank of mist there going off to one side. Clearly, that's not quite what I'm looking for. So I need to rotate that as well. So I'm going to add an input, which is a texture coordinate. We'll use the object output and put that into vector. And that's just sort of push the mist back a bit further, but it's still vertical at the moment. And then I'm going to add, under vector, a mapping node, and we'll rotate Y minus 90. And what's actually happened there is it's actually gone below the surface. It's actually down here. So what I'm going to do is just select that bottom face, as we don't need it all the way down there. Just lift it up to just below the landscape. Now if we go to rendered view and I start to adjust this, you can see there is our mist starting to appear. So in order just to lift that mist up a little bit higher, I'm just going to tweak, in this case X, just to bring it up slightly, bring it up about there, and then I can scale it back a bit here. And if you want it to be a bit more gradual, we can use B-spline, but you will need to play with this quite a bit more. So you can see we've got a sort of ground mist there, but I also wanted some variation in that mist as well. I didn't want it just to be the same all the way across the scene. So I'm going to add, under textures, a noise texture. I'm going to add another color ramp and take the noise texture into that. And then I'm going to add, under converter, a map range node. I just find this to be necessary. Put the value into there. I'm going to add, under converters, a math node into the density. We'll set that to multiply, and we're basically going to multiply the noise with the density from our color ramp. And then I can adjust this here, as well as adjusting my color ramp in order to see that noise. If I look from above, you may be able to see it more clearly. And I'll change this to cardinal, which gives us a sharper fall off. And you can see there's holes in it. So I'll turn the scale up a little bit. And yeah, you can start to see we've got patches of mist, but I'll open that up slightly so they're not quite so severe. And this will change the overall max density of that mist. So that's our mist in the scene. And that's all I did for that. And then finally, I'll just hide the mist for the moment. We need to put our fish in the scene. So I made a little fish model, and there he is. Just a really simple fish image attached to a reasonably fish-shaped object, and a bit of bump applied as well. So we just need to get him placed first of all, maybe something like that. He's just jumped out of the water, obviously. Now I need to select the water and add another modifier, which is the wave modifier. I need to set the start position to my fish. You can do it manually here, and it can be a little tricky to get these settings to where you need them to be. But before we go any further, one of the things that you need for this wave modifier to work is geometry. Now at the moment that water is just got 4 vertices, which isn't going to be enough. So I'm going to subdivide it, make sure we've got fractal switched off, and I'll just subdivide it a few times to start with. I just need a bit of extra geometry before I do the next element, perhaps one more. So I'm now going to select the faces surrounding my fish. So not the whole lot. And I'm going to subdivide it again. The reason I'm doing it like this, I've gone up to 10 subdivisions there, and I think I'm going to go to 25, and I may need to do more than that. The reason I did it like this is that way I've only got increased geometry here. Because it's a flat surface, you won't see that. The only thing you can see is the wave modifier now, because there's additional geometry. I think what I will do though is go out slightly further and subdivide that as well. So we'll go with that for the moment. And you can see our wave there. But obviously it's not the sort of wave we want, so let's try changing some things. So let's put a fall off on it first so it becomes less over time. Now, so we've just got a little spike there. I had a height of 0.07. Let's see what that looks like. Not too bad, it's quite low. I'm going to set this to shade smooth as well, which will help. I think we'll just go to clay view for the moment. I had a very narrow width, so I had 0.007 and I had a narrowness of 25. So if you find it's not really working, it's probably because you still need more geometry. So I'm going to bring this in a little bit and then I'm going to subdivide again a couple of times. Now you can see I'm starting to get something going on there. So I've increased the fall off now and I'm going to decrease the height. I'm just going to add another subdivision to everything and I can reduce the height again. Exact numbers you need will depend on the scale of your specific scene and so on. If you want to offset the fish, you can either use an empty as the target. So I've used the fish as the start position, but you could use an empty, which is then just grouped with the fish, or you should be able to just go into edit mode and move your fish in edit mode, but leave the origin where it is. And then you can see the water splashes have stayed where they were, even though the fish has moved, because obviously he's leaping out of the water, so he doesn't necessarily need to be directly over them. And we can move him around a bit, but obviously we need to be somewhere near to where the additional geometry was added. I mean, you can add it to the whole thing, but that's an awful lot of extra geometry with the number of subdivisions you need. And you can do some of it with a subdivision surface, of course. And there, by playing with the fall off, you can now see I've got that more gradual fall off there. So there's the values that worked for me. But as I say, you will need to play around with these, and they are quite sensitive in order to get that effect to work. So we'll give that a render. And I'll be back in a moment. So that's the render. Obviously this was only 64 samples, so it's still quite a noisy scene. But if you recall, I turned on denoising data under render passes. So if we go to compositor now and say use nodes, we do have these extra outputs which will help us make the scene, even at low samples, a lot smoother. So under filter, previously denoising didn't work very well with volumetrics. But it works a lot better now. They've improved it a lot. So we'll click denoise, drop that in there, but we'll also take in denoising normal and denoising albedo. And then we'll give that a moment. It's processing down there and we'll see what that looks like. Obviously you may still need to turn up the level of samples in order to achieve an acceptable scene, but clearly it will take longer to render if you do that. And there it is. And that looks pretty good for 64 samples and a couple of minutes render time. You see there's our fish, there's our little ripples that he's just created. I added a few little water drops as well. But for a quick scene, haven't even added all of the assets into there. Needs a bit of playing around with the colors, but I think that's not bad. It looks quite like a painting to me. I will provide the original scene with all the assets for my Patreon supporters, and I always do that if you're interested in supporting me. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, don't forget to click like and subscribe and comment. They all help me, and otherwise I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.